What's up, guys? It's Justin, and you are listening to my podcast, The Quest. Today, my guest is Janusz Welin, and I'm super excited to have Janusz on the show because he is my meditation teacher. I've been working with Janusz for over a year, and deepening my meditation practice has been one of the most meaningful things I've ever done in my life. So I've talked about meditation before, but I've often struggled to explain exactly how it's made an impact on me. When I started meditating, it really was to just de-stress, but very quickly after I'd begun, I discovered that I was learning things about the nature of my own consciousness that I'd never really understood or thought about. The biggest change for me has been to experience a lot more equanimity in my own life. I feel like now that I'm meditating, I see the river much more often, and instead of being sucked along with it, I'm much more often able to stand on the banks. Much of this is really due to my work with Janusz, and I found that he's been really able to break down the elements of the experience of consciousness in a way that resonates with me as a frameworks thinker. So in our conversation, we talk about his background as an artist and the intersection between art and meditation, his work bringing the multiple self model found in internal family systems to meditation, the process of awakening and what awakening is, and how technology intersects with meditation, and much more. So really hope you guys enjoy my conversation with Janusz Welin. Janusz, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I was excited to get you on because you've been my meditation teacher for over a year now, and I feel like my practice has gotten much deeper and more meaningful to me during our time working together. And that's something that I really wanted to bring to the audience of the podcast. So I'd like to just start at the beginning and talk a little bit about you and where you came from, how you got here. Can you tell us a bit about how you found your way to meditation?
So my background is maybe a little different. I grew up in this little hippie commune in Rhode Island. I was raised by my mom and my four sisters, and it was lovely. It was sort of idyllic in many ways, and I got to explore the world. That was a central sort of driver of my experience. And this little tiny, plot of land that we had was in the middle of a pretty conservative town. And my experience was that in interacting with the world, it was very much out of line with what was important to me. And, I went to a public school and people were not having my, sort of strange hippie ways. And very quickly, I needed to find a way of relating to the world that not only helped me feel more secure in myself, but also help me understand how could the world be so strange, or how could people be so ingrained in these habits that seem to not really serve themselves. A lot of people were, there's a lot of hatred or a lot of anger, this kind of thing. And I really wanted to know very early on what was happening for myself and in the world. And I basically lived a kind of contemplative life, wandering around in the woods, looking at things, hanging out with my family. And meditation was sort of an innate skill that I was developing. And I think that I became very interested over time in forms of meditation, initially through Zen, that showed you how to meditate throughout your life all the time, rather than a little moment on the cushion, and then hopefully that would last throughout the day. And so as a teenager, I began to explore and read into Zen material, and I had a little bit of contact with the monastics. But really, it was just a personal exploration. I had no teacher. I had no one to guide me, and I learned from books, which I realized later meant that I would shelve all of my questions. If I had a question, I'd just ignore it, which was not an ideal format for learning. At some point, I started making artwork and became really interested in this way that I would interact with the world, looking at my perception and seeing how that could translate through my hand. And the filter there is my mind. And you would watch the mind. If it does some weird thing and gets distracted, suddenly the image you were drawing, et cetera, would be weirder or wouldn't hold together or just look sort of silly. And it became very interesting. And I realize now, looking back, that I was really exploring the experience of existing. What is it like to exist as a human in the world?
That's a lot of introspection for a teenager. How did you stay on the course or know that you were doing it right? Or I'm surprised. I don't think looking back to when I was in my teens, I don't think I would have been able to focus long enough or stick with something long enough to really develop a practice.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's worth mentioning that I was also a teenager, like smoking pot and hanging out and partying and stuff was part of the way that I related to the world. But there was this very earnest sense of really wanting to have a rich experience, wanting to know the world deeply. And a lot of, extremely amateur philosophizing with my friends, trying to understand what this world is. What are we doing? What is this experience of being alive? So I don't think I had great concentration, but I had a strong drive. I sort of knew what was important to me. And I feel very lucky that I had the opportunity to do art making and have support there, because that really is what centered my practice for a long time. And I went to school for art. I was just really, really ambitious in art making for a long time. And that was a central driver for most of my life. And I realize now that was my practice. That was the meditation practice itself.
How does meditation relate to art?
Well, for me, it relates very strongly. One is what I mentioned before, that if you're doing observational artwork, which is my favorite kind of artwork, it feels like the most honest kind, there's a way in which you have to get out of the way and you have to really be present with what's happening. And if you can't do that, the image you produce looks like you made it up. It looks like a cartoon. But if you can be with that, the image and experience feels very unique and authentic to itself, feels very real. That's one part. The other side is, as I started to get into weirder and weirder ways of making artwork, I became really interested in performance art and again, this idea of how to bring the meditative practice into my life, conceptual art, and how do I bring this out into the world and how do I affect people? That was a very important thing for me, is how do I help people impact their lives in a way that would be beneficial to them, sort of a utopian idea that you might find in artwork. As I started to do that, there was this major challenge, which is that I had to imagine what someone else's experience would be. I would say, okay, the person's going to enter the room from this direction, and first they'll see this big yellow thing. What does yellow mean to somebody else? And what is it going to mean to this group or that group? Whereas with meditation, I can just ask, and I say, what's happening inside of your mind? And I can teach a lot of the same material. That's something that seems very interesting to me now, is that it feels like I'm actually teaching the same material I was when I was, making artwork, which is really about abstraction. What does it mean to deconstruct the experience of being a person, being an existing, perceiving entity, and reconstructing that in a way that is helpful to people's lives? That's the ideal goal for me of the artwork that I was making. And meditation and teaching meditation personally feels like a much more direct route.
And so you went to school for art, and once you told me that before you were a full-time meditation teacher, you were a fabricator making sculptural art. So how did you make the transition from the art world to the meditation world?
Well, there is a strong overlap between these sort of transitional arcs. I think the central defining moment that sort of makes that crux happen is 9/11, which happened in the last semester of my time at college. And it was crushing. It was unbelievably hard for me. And it was really this point in my life where I had to decide, either I'm going to dedicate myself to growth and being a better person, or I'm going to just self-annihilate, because it was too painful. Those are the two skills that I possibly had, was either I'm going to drink myself into a stupor, or I'm going to really dive into this, the meditation and this other side of life that was sort of had been in the background.
Why was it such a triggering moment for you, or what, I guess, such a fork in the road?
I think there were a lot of things that built up, which had to do with feeling somewhat isolated, feeling like something was off in my life. Something wasn't landing. Something was missing, effectively. And then the experience of the tragedy of that day was just, it was really, really remarkable. And I don't know if anyone else had this experience, but it's like all these people in my school start dropping out. People are suicidal, and this is not a school of people who knew people who passed away. This is a school in Baltimore, barely connected. But what it felt like to me is that somehow, for the first time in my life, we as a people, as a community, as a country, as a nation, had been wounded. And it's, very luxurious that we haven't had that experience earlier, but it felt like for the first time, this giant social experience had been wounded. And somehow that hit me so hard that my entire way of relating to the world was thrown up into the air, and I had to decide, where do I want to land?
And so you chose to invest further in the growth path.
Luckily, I did. At first, I did not. At first, I tried my other route, which is like maybe, just being very ambitious about artwork and maybe like partying with my friends. This is actually the route to go. And it just was such a dead end that at some point soon after, I really dove into the spiritual path. And that's really what defined my life, since then, has been just this dedication to ethics. For one thing, I became very interested in practicing ethics all throughout the day and evaluating, is what I'm doing helpful, kind, considerate? Is it driven by fear or selfishness, or is it driven by altruism, etc.? That became very, very interesting to me, and looking at that throughout the day. And through different meditation practices to learn to practice continuously throughout every aspect of my life.
What was your journey to finding the practice that you have now? When you were younger, you were kind of studying Zen, and then how did you discover the practice that you're practicing now?
Yeah. So the practice that I have now is, I'd say, a mix of three different streams. One is when I mentioned, stopping using substances, stopping the sort of partying lifestyle. A lot of that comes from, and a lot of my practice comes from the morality that comes out of a 12-step recovery sort of community. That's a lot of my background. When I was young, in my 20s, that was this sort of entree into maybe kindness and being with the community and helping other people could actually make me feel better. That was the sort of entryway. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is psychology, and generally being very interested in, doing my own psychology, but studying which aspects of a psychological approach are most useful for me and for the people I see around me, rather than it being sort of a theoretical thing. I think in college I had this idea that if I could understand reality well enough through theory and through artwork and reading, this kind of thing, that I would be free. And it just never worked. It always felt like I was right at the precipice of really understanding, and one more essay and one more thing, and I would be there. And it just never worked. And so I became very interested in a kind of tactile, experiential process. And the thing that I think is the most core part of my practice today is mindfulness. And the mindfulness I became interested in was one that was developed by a teacher named Shinzen Young, who pulled in together all of these disparate traditions, all of these lineages, all of these different paths, and created a kind of periodic table of these various types of meditating. And for me, that was really important in order to see all of these pieces coming together, to see all of these different ways of relating to the world, the ways of exploring the world, and see how they overlapped and interacted with each other. And since then, what's been very important for me is to recognize, how do I guide people into a path that is unique to them? Because one of the things I see most often is people either pick a path that someone designed for themselves, or a community that maybe existed 1,000 years ago, and not one that is in line with what's important to them. And I think that was the central challenge that I had for so much of my life, was doing things that were out of alignment with what was actually really important to me, because A, I couldn't see that at the beginning, and then B, I didn't know how to navigate that, or how to meditate in a way that would bring me closer to what's really important.
Can you tell us a little bit about the journey from pivoting hard into meditation and the spiritual path, and knowing that you wanted to do that, and then getting to the place that you're at today, where, from my external observation, you're one of the calmest and kindest people that I ever interacted with? What were the milestones in your practice that let you know that you were on a path that would be fulfilling and fruitful?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I don't usually talk so much about the recovery side of my origin story, but it's important. It's still an important way of how I relate to the world. But that was an introduction for me into this idea that giving of oneself could be a transformational path. And anyone who's been involved in that kind of thing really knows that it really is, once you get past the kind of initial things about, let's not use this substance that's messing up your entire life, it really becomes about how can you help and support other people? And how can you think in a way that doesn't require this ego that needs to be defended and protected? And for me, that was a really central insight, a central way of changing how I looked at the world. I really had unconsciously developed a kind of self-centered way of relating to the world that was just dominating all of these decisions I was making, all of my interactions in subtle and gross ways that I was unaware of, that I didn't connect with. So that was really the ground floor of a lot of this transformation. And the next area that I think was pretty important was an interest in what's called classical awakening and Buddhism, enlightenment, this kind of thing. And reading about this, not from this kind of magical, otherworldly, it's a Santa Claus thing that maybe happened in the past, but reading about it from the perspective of scientists and contemporary contemplatives who were doing it and saying, no, this is a real thing. And not only is it real, but you can get there. It is a step-by-step process. It's obviously somewhat different for everybody, but it is a real and available lineage. And when I found that, there was a little bit of a 1-2 punch. I'd been spending so much time really looking at ethics and trying to be a good person, waking up in the morning and doing an inventory of how could I be a better person today? And at the end of the day, looking at what I had done and saying, okay, how did I meet those goals? Doing that so much, for years, that when I found a really strong mindfulness practice, not one where I'm just pay attention to your breath and I'll see you later, which is what I had mainly come in contact with up until that point. One that was really about this path of awakening. It sort of hit like a thunderbolt and things started changing very, very rapidly for me. And when I say changing for me, I mean perceptually, internally. The way the mind was reading the world started to shift as the practice ramped up. And I became very enamored with this idea of the possibility of awakening. And now this is something that is the center of my life. It's a lot of what I teach and what I talk about. So the momentum of these two things together really started to propel what I was doing. And the practice just started to accelerate on its own to the point where these kind of mystical experiences start happening more and more. And again, I'm not a big, mystical guy. I'm not about to bust out the crystals and this kind of thing. And I was very interested in this direct experience that has been described in texts for, thousands of years. And is it possible for human beings to have access to that today?
So for the layperson who maybe is new to meditation, what is the awakening experience?
It's a funny question because it's in certain traditions, in
certain traditions, you don't tell people because you're not trying to create an expectation for them, right?
Well, not only that, but there's various traditions. In some traditions, you don't talk about it even at all. You're like, we don't talk about that. It's just, and then in other traditions, it's different. So it's a question that I get, and I always think it feels a little funny to answer. But the way I define it is that awakening is when the mind and body default to a different position. And that position is where it will metabolize the difficulty and pain of existing, the challenges that we have internally, and it will tend towards the joyous and powerfully awe-inspiring experience of existing by default. So that's how I define the experience of awakening. And the route to get there is by knowing our sensory experience in this particular moment and by accepting it without resistance. And when those channels of resistance break down, the system naturally on its own expands in a way that is fairly consistent, described throughout a lot of traditions and throughout time, but is quite powerful and is ineffable. It's hard to put into words in a certain way, but it is clearly a significant difference experientially.
And is this experience a binary thing where, people are either in it or not? Or is it something that you can slip into over time and maybe get to gradually? I think this is a question that I've often asked you.
Yeah, it's absolutely the latter. And it's very hard to get across how much the path of awakening and awakening is built out of this particular moment. And there's this imagined sense of what it would be, this sort of magical experience where, we have no problems, or maybe we're floating in light, or this kind of thing. And that gets in the way, because what it actually is the system experiencing this particular moment with a kind of clarity that is transformational. It changes who we are, and it moves us to a place where this moment is rewriting who we are over and over again. So not only is it something that usually for most people builds up gradually, and there are some, moments of fireworks where there's some big change that occurs. It creeps up gradually, but also it is 100% built out of this particular moment. It's built out of these perceptual pieces. So there's this kind of joke or classic trope that you hear about that happened to a friend of mine, specifically a friend, Jeff Warren, who was on retreat, and he experiences stream entry, which is the first level of classical awakening. And he goes to our teacher, Shinzen, and he just keeps saying, I can't believe how ordinary it is. I can't believe how ordinary it is. And there is this sort of very, very ordinary aspect to that path. And recognizing that, we see that this experience we're having now is the doorway to that material. So it is a slow process, and we have direct access to it right now.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. In my experience, I've found that since we've been working together, I am just much more okay with whatever is going on in my own experience. I kind of entered this work thinking something would change, something magical would happen, or some rainbows or something. I'd sit there long enough and then everything would change. But what I found is actually the more I've practiced, the more everything seems great as it is. I've been more in the present and not resisting whatever the experience of the current moment is, whether it's a difficult one or a positive one or whatever. And that's very different for me. I think I resonate with what you said earlier, where most of my life I'd lived in a very self-centered way, which I don't say negatively. I mean, like more just I was the center of the universe, my own universe. And anything that kind of wasn't going the way that I wanted was like really bad, something that I had to change at that moment. I was very fixated on making everything go the way that I wanted at any given moment. And of course, life doesn't work that way. The universe doesn't work that way. And so there was often that would create challenges for me in my experience. And as we've been working together, that has changed a lot. That's, it hasn't been binary. It hasn't been like that completely went away, but it's just, I'm much more okay with whatever's going on at any given moment. So it's been quite an experience for me, but a very normal seeming one. I'm curious, can you tell us another part of the practice that's really resonated with me that you teach is the parts work? Can you tell us a little bit about that and what it is, how you came to it?
Yeah. So I think you're referring to what we all call the multiple self model.
Yeah.
So that is something that we became really interested in when we looked at this comparison again between psychological, let's say, technology and meditation technology that's been developing. On the psychological side, internal family systems is a very good process that has already taken a lot of meditation, pulling from a lot of these same traditions. So there's already this overlap here. What we became interested in was this idea related to Buddhism, which is around self and non-self. And I'm not a strict Buddhist, but I very much like a lot of Buddhist technology. And this idea of self and non-self has been integral for my process and in my life. In Buddhism, there's this premise that the self experience, which anyone listening to this can check in on, is there an experience of something telling us that we are a self, that there is a center to this universe, the central character. that is not a consistent experience, that the self tells us, I've always been here, I'm the true unit of measure of reality. And if we look at any of the aspects of self carefully enough, they just break apart. And this is very powerful because, like you were describing a minute ago, we can spend a life fighting to protect that self or to navigate that self or to live by that self's interest. And if that self becomes more transparent or even disappears, we have a lot more freedom of choice in this way. So this is a very important Buddhist insight. And the multiple self model brings that a little further, bringing in some of the internal family systems ideas, saying actually we have many selves. And at any given point, one of those selves can take over and say, oh, life is hopeless, what's the point? And really color our entire sphere of experiencing, and we'll make decisions that really don't fit us very well. Another self can take over and say, everything is good all the time, and I should only feel happy feelings, which is, that's a belief we might have. But each one of these selves has these specific features, which is it tells us in the moment that it is the only one. And when we begin to navigate these various experiences of self and realize that they too are transparent, we get a lot more internal freedom, especially in relationship to our histories, our pasts. Because all of us have these different forces within us. We want to watch something on the couch and eat some ice cream, and we want to do something really ambitious and take over the world. And these two parts will fight each other, and we'll have internal arguments, and everyone's familiar with this. What's important to know is that we tend to alienate or exile some of these parts. If we're a very ambitious person, we'll say, oh, the part of me that wants to relax is a loser, and I just got to get rid of that part. Or the part of me that feels ashamed or like I'm not good enough, I just need to stuff that part down and be very strong in the world, and then I'll be free. I'll be more free. The key is that each of these different parts has its own fundamental and wholesome need. And if we deny those needs, well, that's where addiction and, acting in ways that we really don't believe in come from, because these parts will fight to get their needs met. The thing I'll often say is someone will feel a need to feel connected, to feel excited, to have a kind of spiritual experience, to have lots of energy. And so they're going to try out crack cocaine. It's like, no, too far. So the key is to find out what these needs are below these behaviors and then meet those needs, and the behaviors don't need to occur anymore.
So the needs aren't wrong. It's maybe the implementations of the behaviors that go against what our long-term goals are.
Exactly. And that's where the conflict arises. The conflict arises because the part of us that wants to relax will just, throw away the project that's really important to us, while the part of us that wants to be ambitious will say, no relaxation, we're staying up, we're working 90 hours a week, and they'll fight with each other. And until someone can get clear on these various needs and their various values, they're going to live a life of internal conflict that will never end, because they can't even see that these things are fighting with themselves.
So internal family systems therapy kind of focuses on having a dialogue with a therapist about, with these parts. How does meditation intersect with the multiple self model?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I want to say is that Raquel and my wife and I had been developing this material for a long time and realized there was such a strong connection with internal family systems. So I'm hesitant to say our system is better or whatever. We focus more on the meditation side and more on the side where you can train yourself outside of sessions, because internal family systems is really about sessions with a trained professional. And what we're thinking about is, again, how to bring meditation into every aspect of our life. So that's the main central difference. But all of this is training our system, because the system will tend towards its own defaults. It has various habit grooves. It's used to doing certain things in certain orders. We hear, it's Pavlovian. We hear a certain sound, our alarm clock, our body goes into a routine. It sort of runs through these things. But that happens at all these levels internally. We hear a certain voice or we feel a certain emotion, and the system will just fall into this pattern. So where meditation comes in is not only to be able to detect these patterns, but to be able to deconstruct them so they don't have as much pull or power over us. And to find out, and this is really important, this is something that gets missed a lot, where is home? where do we reside? Because if we're not trying to reside in a self, and we're not trying to reside in something that is going to accomplish a task or get a certain object, and then we'll be happy, because we've all learned that that just doesn't work. We've tried it 1,000 times, and we get that new gadget, and it's, maybe 2 seconds in, we're like, oh, this didn't work. And then it's on to the next one. Where is home? Where is the place where the mind and the body can rest? Because our whole system is always driving for the next moment. If we stop talking suddenly, we can feel this pull. Something's supposed to happen. The system just wants another thing. So when is it going to rest? When is it going to finally be satisfied? And so part of what we do in meditation, this particular meditation, is helping people connect with what we call kind awareness, which is a way of perceiving the world that is very welcoming, that doesn't need us to be any different. It doesn't need the world to be any different. It allows for all of the human foibles that we have. And this is very important because we can often think that developing our lives or moving towards a path of awakening means we won't have difficult feelings and thoughts and we'll be free of all of our challenges. But actually, knowing and accepting them as just another expression of nature is central to really being free.
So switching gears a little bit, how should somebody find a meditation teacher? For me, I think I tried a bunch of different things before meeting you, and a lot of the way you explain things or your interests, that really resonated with me. And so I found like working with you and the meditations and like your explanations for things to be much more easy to understand than anything I had ever, worked with before. So I'm curious, how do you recommend people find a teacher that resonates with them? Or like, is there like one path? Should people be exploring many different things?
Yeah, the right path is just take down my email and no. So, I think the joke is that every teacher says that to some degree. And while they sort of pay some attention and say, okay, there's lots of possible ways to go, ultimately there is one true teaching. And very lucky for you, I happen to teach that, right? That's what everyone says in one form or another. And so what I personally like is teachers who teach in a metasystemic way, who can view the various systems and see how they interact and see, that there's benefit to this system and there's downsides to this system, like there would be with any kind of meditation. And those are the folks that I gravitate towards. I'm always very cautious of teachers who use words like always. It'll, every time you do it like this, it'll always have these benefits, these kind of things. And people talk in these words because they attract people. If you do my system, you will always have the magical benefit of, ... I am always wary of that. I like people who are a little bit more scientific and they say, yeah, the tendency is if you do this over this much time, this will be, the likelihood, but I'm not going to guarantee. And hey, you might want to check out this other person because they're going to have this other experience that's going to be a little different. I like recommending folks to try different things, but I always feel a little hesitant because often people will get into a circle of people who say ours is the one true path. And they'll talk about the benefits of their path and the deficits of every other path. It's very common. So that's my larger overall caveat. But what I typically say is you want to find a teacher that can hear you and you can hear them. By that, I mean, you can hear them, you can feel what they're saying, it connects with you. There's something about it that really connects with what you need. And they can hear you, which is much less common because we deal with these sort of superstar teachers who they're never going to hear me. I'm talking to some podcast of this person. It's like, hello, can you hear me? So it's important that there is that interaction in that way. And for me personally, I like people who've trained in Shinzen system because it is very metasystemic. And I like folks who are open about awakening. And we'll talk about awakening in a comfortable way without it being a sort of weird taboo topic. Now, with all those caveats, that slims the number of teachers down pretty considerably. But that's generally how I recommend folks look for someone.
With a lot of Eastern teachers or traditions, part of the appeal, I guess, or the selling point or the way they present it is, we've been doing this for thousands of years and like it's known to work. We have so many examples or iterations, or, it's a time tested tradition that goes back 3,000 years, 10,000 years, whatever. I've heard a lot of many thousands of years. And so, one of the things that's interesting about what you're doing and maybe some teachers in the West is that they're innovating, right, in a way, or combining things from psychology or what we know about the mind today. How do you reconcile those two things? Because there is an appeal, I think, to just, this part of me is like, oh, it worked for so many other people, and there's this whole tradition that's a thousands of years old tradition. I should just shut up and do what they're saying, and that will probably be the best shot, that I have.
Yeah, and I think that actually is a good idea. Honestly, I recommend that people, at least for a period of their lives, try just doing what they're told. It's very hard for Westerners, just do what you're told, especially if you trust the tradition. And that said, various people get their authority through various means, and an appeal towards tradition is excellent and is perfectly valid. And that said, if you spend any time in these traditions, you realize, they're made up of people, and they have all the same foibles that we might have in any other circumstance. So I like things that have an appeal to my way of relating to the world. They can speak in my language. And I also like to, as problematic as it can be, cherry pick to some degree. I like a lot of Buddhist technology, but I wouldn't consider myself a strict Buddhist. I like a lot of the early Buddhism, the Theravada. But when I have spent time in monasteries, and I recommend anyone, we can go on retreats, just go to a monastery in Asia. They're lovely, they're powerful. They're not going to cater to your needs. There may be fleas, and that's what's up, and you just deal with it and you do the practice. They don't all have fleas. That's just one month that I spent in a monastery had a lot of fleas. So to do that, to interact with those traditions. But when I get there and at some point I say, I ask a question about, do we really believe that there are, devas living in the trees that are these sort of tree spirits that help us if we do good things in the world? And they'll just fully be like, yes, there are. Go practice. And you're like, oh, okay. And for that time, it's perfect for me. But at some point, I want a little bit more of a view that fits my perspective. And for that, I like the sort of scientific perspective where we're open to the possibility that perception could be real. We could perceive that those things are real, and we could even feel the effects of those things, but we're viewing it with a little bit more open skepticism.
Along that line, what are the advances in science or our understanding of the mind that have changed the way people understand meditation in the West?
Yeah. I'm not a scientist, and it's interesting because typically we think of science being in advance of other traditions, especially ones that are based in, ritual or based in meditation or an internal exploration. But in terms of meditation technology, science hasn't quite caught up. The brain scans that we can do are effectively extremely primitive. So there have been brain scans done of people who are meditating and they experience cessation, which is, just to give people a little bit of an idea, it's where reality effectively shuts off due to meditation, and it's an absolute zero. This is the word nibbana or nirvana means an absolute zero that is fully fulfilling. It's like the ultimate zero. So we've had brain scans occur, fMRI scans, while someone has that experience, a relatively rarefied experience in meditation, although available to people if it's, of interest. It's the first stage of awakening, or it's the indicator of awakening. And the scientists look at that and they don't know what to do. They're like, we're not even sure if there's a difference in the brain that we could see. So they're watching this material, and this person has cessation. They come out and they say, "Oh yeah, it was at this point in the scan." And they're like, "I don't know. We can't even tell yet." So there's a way in which the technology is trying to catch up with the meditation tech. That said, there are some really interesting advances happening. In particular, actually, the same teacher Shinzen, who's also a scientist, they're studying low frequency ultrasound and shutting off certain parts of the brain symmetrically, so 2 units shutting off these little tiny parts of the brain symmetrically, and having these effects that are potentially profound, where people could potentially experience great amounts of pain and it doesn't bother them. They're not unconscious. They're fully aware, and it doesn't bother them. So the potential of that, let's say for the pain relief industry, imagine people have surgery, and rather than knocking them out on drugs that might kill them, we access a part of their brain, quiet it down, and they just sit there and watch the surgery occur, and they can feel the pain, but it doesn't bother them, and it's fine. And at the end, when they come to and they're all patched up, they have this sense of, wow, I don't need to treat the pain emotionally or physically as a real thing that has to dominate my life. I can actually observe it in a way that is free from those constraints. And so they come out a richer person. So the potential there is quite, it's crazy that we could actually help people move towards awakening while they're in surgery.
Yeah.
That to me is like, this is where we start to get into this kind of bizarro magical world where the two start really rhyming off each other.
Do you think if there were those tools to move people towards the path of awakening, it would be a medical device, would that be something that you think people should use? I feel like I have this voice in my head that's the, kind of maybe traditional meditator or meditation teacher saying like, this is an invalid path,
Yeah. And I think that that's a good point in that it indicates something. What it indicates is we do need to train the system. We can use a psychedelic substance, for instance, and have this peak experience. But how does that change the way that we speak when we're speaking to someone that we're frustrated with, or a child? Or how does that change the way we hold our body as we move through the world? Is it with more peace, or what's the effect? Now, the effect might be there, but it's a hard leap. It's a hard gap. That's one of the hardest things people have, is they have these beautiful experiences, one kind or another, and they don't know how to integrate that into their lives. Meditation is that integration. Those peak experiences show us this beautiful vista, but it will not traverse the terrain for us. Meditation is learning the skill of moving through that terrain. And it's also very decadent because it's endless. You can always keep developing. You always refine what's important to you and refine the way the mind works. So if you have some peak experience, you can then leverage that into living a life that's closer to what is important to you. And the question I typically ask students is not, do you want to experience stream entry? My question is typically, what kind of life do you want after stream entry? Because that's very important on how we move someone there. We could think that this idea of awakening is an end point, and really it's a beginning point. It's living a life that's very deeply aligned with what's important to us and very deeply aligned with the world in a kind of natural form, the world telling us what is real, pain, joy, neutrality, all of these things in a way that's transformative, in a way that is a feedback loop that feeds back on itself.
It brings up an interesting question to me, which is, if you're living the life that you want, does the stream entry and awakening matter at all? Is there some like ultimate end to having those things in your life?
Yeah, well, I think what you're asking is, if you're already living a life that feels fulfilled, that feels rich, everything is how you'd like it to be, is there any reason to pursue something like awakening?
Yeah.
I would love to say absolutely. Here are the benefits and you should do it no matter what. But I think a more honest answer is maybe not. If things are exactly the way you want them to be, you feel deeply in touch with who you want to be, you feel fulfilled, and there's no sense that there's an area for growth. I haven't really met anyone like that. If you ask a few questions very quickly, people say, well, yeah, of course I would like, to X, Y, and Z, or I can do this perfectly until I meet my in-laws. And then this goes through the roof, right? There's always some space for growth. And then the other side of it, which is I usually downplay because it's not the most important part for me. For me, it's about fulfillment, but it's also really, really cool. It's very, decadent, amazing. It really is falling in love with reality. It's falling in love with the fiber of existing. And I couldn't think of anything more interesting or exciting. I've talked to you about this, but no amount of, VR technology or cinematography or directorial genius could depict the decadence of this particular moment. We can look around in our lives right now, and it's so unbelievably rich. It has within it every possible experience a human could have. And if we can learn to fall in love with that, it can be disorienting, especially at first, but it can also be, it is the richest possible experience a human could have because it is the experience of being a human.
It's interesting and kind of hard to conceive of that because I think we've all had experiences where we look at the world through new eyes. It might be like climbing that mountain and then you see a vista, amazing vista or sunrise or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, this is incredible. And it might be a psychedelic experience. I've had it on psychedelics where you're just looking at everything around you. You're like with wide, beginner's eyes, and you're like, oh, this is amazing. But to think of a world where you are having that experience all the time, you're looking at everything through the amazing eyes of somebody who has never experienced it before, that seems like almost hard to conceive of, or like, how would you operate in life?
That's actually a real problem. And we've talked about this before, it can be challenging for people. And this is the other side that I want to mention. It is not this magical MacGuffin that if we experience it, then everything will be good. It has its own world of strangeness to it. And there are people who, leave their jobs. They are no longer interested in doing X, Y, and Z because they realize it just doesn't meet this innate need. There are people who, the joke is that people will experience these things, deeply dedicate themselves to it, and they'll come home and their taxes aren't paid and their, spouse has left them. So people can get so entangled in this stuff that it's so fascinating, or these are possibilities. And we can program against that. We can, set up things that make that less likely, in large part, having it be very integrated into our lives, make our lives more important. We don't have to ignore our lives in order to have these experiences. We actually find them in our lives, which is, for me, the ultimate way to avoid that kind of dysfunction. But there are periods in the process where we have to relearn how to have a conversation. The drives that we used to run us aren't there anymore. I remember being on a retreat once and just having a pretty, maybe fireworksy experience. And I left the meditation hall and I was walking. And at some point I realized I'm not walking anymore. I'm just standing still. And I have one foot in front of the other, but I'm just standing there. And I'm sort of trying to walk. I know I need to walk. I need to get someplace. And I'm like, I don't have any motivation. It's very, very, very satisfying. I was like, why would I ever change anything about this? This is unbelievably satisfying. And I was like, it was this very strange experience. And at some point I realized, well, I'm supposed to meet somebody over here. And just that sense of obligation was enough to get me to start to like slowly move, in that direction. But these are real things that we have to contend with. The joke that I'll say is, try, bringing your kids to soccer when you don't exist. It's like, so there can be very strange parts of this process. And there can be parts of this process that are very disorienting. And for some people, that disorientation is very extreme. And just to be, full disclosure, there are cases where people will have a sense that it is empty, that there is no self that needs to be defended, but somehow the mind is also convinced that this is bad. And the way that I try to program against that is to recognize that there's a self, back to the multiple self model, there's a self that wants and needs freedom, and it sees this beautiful vista and is fully drawn into it. And there's a self that needs safety, and it doesn't want to go there. And so there's this kind of existential internal fight. And until we can meet the needs of that part that needs safety, we are going to be in this complete turmoil continuously. Leonard Cohen is actually a very significant meditation practitioner. He practiced alongside Shinzen in a monastery in actually California. And he has a quote or a lyric about this exact moment. And he says, you either become the ocean or you're seasick every day. And he doesn't say you learn to swim. He doesn't say you find a life raft. You have to become this weird transformation, to become this flux of reality forming itself. And until you can accept that, the system fights itself internally. And that's the highest level of potential turmoil. Most people don't experience that, The statistics are somewhere in the 1 to 5 percentile range. But I think like any medication or any significant thing that could affect your life, it's important to mention that caveat. It's like some people experience the caveat at the end. It is important to mention that those things are real.
This is the warning on the label.
Exactly. This is the quickly mumbled expression of what could go wrong. But again, if it goes wrong, you seek out a teacher who knows how to navigate you through that. That's the answer.
This is one of the things that kind of can go wrong at maybe the really deep end once you get down the path. One of the things that prevents a lot of friends of mine from even really wanting to invest in the path, I think I've heard a lot of, this is my edge. My lack of equanimity in a way is my edge to be successful or get the things I want in the world. And one of the things I like about your practice is that it really is reflective of the ethics of the person, in that you will ask, what kind of life do you want to have at the end of it? And then how, are we going to get there? And is meditation a tool that can help you get there?
Yeah.
So for those people who are maybe think it's not a tool or would prevent them from achievement or success in the world, like how would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, there's a little bit of a problem that we have in meditation, which is currently people associate meditation with two main things. One, stress reduction, and two, calm. Right? Those are perfectly good aspects. And it's not surprising that in our particular culture, those are the two things that people grab onto. Right? In our culture, trust me, I could use a little less stress and be a little bit more calm. Those would be lovely experiences. But we're really talking about a fully 3D experience of reality. It's everything you could experience, without exception. Everything a human being can experience is part of the meditative process if, you have someone who can guide you in that direction. So what I typically say is that if you're able to turn that off, that dissatisfaction, which is true, it does drive things. I'm a fine artist. That's my background. And you look for flaws. No, a little bit more this way, a little bit more that way. And that's called aesthetics. And you improve things until you can't anymore and you call it done. That's a central driving factor. The problem is when I can't shut that off, and the way my wife is sort of doing that thing or handling our new puppy, like I'm just going to get in there and I can see problems in everything in the world. And it feels like I just am driven by that force unless I can shut it off. And so wanting doesn't care if we're happy. It just wants. And if I can have the ability to turn that off, that's lovely. If I can't turn that off, it's not freedom, it's prison. It's like, sorry, but if I don't have the ability to step aside from that, then it is prison. And typically what happens is in our culture, people are so busy searching for that brass ring, trying to get that promotion or get the thing that feels very clearly like it will finally make things feel satisfied. Until they really get all of those things, there is a sense that will satisfy them. And often I'll work with people who are retired or who have retired and now they've started a foundation and they're like, I thought it would work, but there's still something missing. So for me, it's to train both things at the same time, to train that edge, that dissatisfaction, the lack of equanimity, but to not hone my entire life down into one color and not be able to see the entire palette of experiencing. To me, there's a loss there. For me, I want more, but that's also my personal drive and interest is those things. And maybe for some people, that's just not of interest.
One other question I had, which is a little bit of a gear switch, is I love that you are using technology to introduce meditation and, more broadly and maybe facilitate practice. And so you're probably on the very cutting edge of meditation teachers out there. We didn't know it beforehand, but you actually have a Twitch stream. After we started working together, I learned that you have a Twitch stream and you use Discord. It's kind of like to create a digital Sangha for the people who are following your practice. So can you tell us a little bit about how the technology can intersect with meditation and your explorations in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope it's okay. Can I tell the story of how that discovery happened?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I think it was our first session or maybe second session. And I said, if you want to listen to this meditation that I'm describing, because I have just this huge library of like hundreds. But I record them on the live streams. And I said, if you want to, you can listen to this live stream. It's on Twitch, twitch.tv/deep mindfulness. And you said, like you sort of perked up, and I was like, oh yeah, Twitch is, and I explained to you what Twitch was, because most people are like, what is that? And I was like, it's like YouTube, except it's all live. And I really prefer it because X, Y, and Z. And then you were like, oh yeah, cool. Yeah, I came up with that. And it was just such a funny moment. I was like, oh, well, okay, I guess you know how to get there then. So yeah, that was funny. So yeah, for me, the technology, and I think this is something that people miss because of, I don't want to say it's because of a reliance on a sort of traditional path. They're just so used to it being a certain way. And what I think is that we think in technology now. We experience the world through technology. The technology we're interacting with is shaping our minds. And I like to say that we're always meditating. This is a fact. Anyone listening to this, we're always meditating, but we're meditating on resentment or fear or, worrying about what people think about us. And we get to choose, do we want to align that process that's already happening with things that are important to us? Technology can easily take us away from our values. And it can be a thing that, we've seen all the weird things that the internet can do and that, various social media platforms can do. And they have just as much potential to bring us to what's important to us. So what I like to do is see if I can find the ways that we can hotwire the technology that is actually in support of what is significant in people's lives. So we do the live stream, we do the, all of our classes through Zoom and this kind of thing. So for me, it's just a matter of talking to people in the way that they can hear.
I love that. I think that, technology is this amazing platform to reach a whole new segment of people that have never been reached by this message before. And I really love, Calm and Headspace as examples because they're very simple apps, but, I would never started meditating without Headspace. Like that was my introduction, and, it was very simple, and maybe it's like very one-dimensional in a way, but it got me started and got me interested and curious, which led me to other, to invest more in the growth path and then to meet you eventually. Are there any, that was all the questions I kind of had. Are there any other things that you would want to say to maybe my audience largely is people who don't have experience meditating but I think are very interested in the self-growth path? Anything you'd want to say to them?
The only thing I would say is that we can have more fulfilling lives, and that fulfillment is a skill, and we can get better and better at learning what's happening internally and falling in love with this weird, very strange world of, existing as a human being. And that can translate into having a better life for ourselves and a better life for those around us. Meditation is simply the tool of cultivating those skills. I just recommend to folks, even if it's not some kind of formal meditation in this particular moment, is to just take in this experience that's occurring for you, looking around your environment, hearing the sounds. This is billions of years of biological technology spilling out into the experience of a human consciousness. This is all of the decisions you've ever made in your life coming into this particular moment. It's all of the conditions in life that we can't control producing an experience that is incredibly unique. It'll never be like this ever again. And we have one chance in our lives to know this particular moment. And if we can do that, it sets us up for a way of relating to the world that is richer and richer and more transformative over time.
Beautiful. Thank you. Where can people find you online?
Yeah. So a couple places. One is just our website, which is deepmindfulness.io. Also, we, as you mentioned, live stream 3 days a week at 11 a.m. Eastern, which is twitch.tv/deepmindfulness. And another thing, which I'll see if you can share the link, is that for every student we start with these same 15 guided meditations. And I typically will recommend folks try those because they go through each one of the sense gates. teaching people how to meditate, not just on the breath, although that comes up, but how to meditate when you're walking outside or interacting with somebody, this kind of thing. So that's also a really central key tool that we use with folks.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll share those in the show notes. Cool. Well, Janusz, thanks a lot for spending the time with me today. That was
super fun.
Really great conversation. I think a lot of people will get a lot of benefit from it.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And as always, I love your practice. So thanks again.
That was my conversation with Janusz. I really love the way that he explained the benefits and reasons to meditate, and really hope that you guys liked it and found it interesting. I'm really excited for more people out there to try meditation and see the same benefits that I have. Working with Janusz has been really meaningful to me, and if you want to check him out, you can find him at deepmindfulness.io. That's deepmindfulness.io. And as always, if you loved the quest, please bang out a 5-star rating on iTunes and give me some love and feedback on Twitter. Thanks, and I'll see you guys next time.